welcome everyone. My name is Mike Dolph, Chief Revenue Officer at InflowCX. Been with the company about 8 years now, and excited to be talking with you today on the topic that we've got. Really, this is for those who are really interested in the the end of the road really for Genesys PureConnect and Multicloud. These are two things that have been announced this year, a couple months apart. We'll talk about what's that mean, and really more importantly, what's Genesys doing, and what are customers in that place? What are we seeing them do? What are their options? And talk through that. So we'll jump in. As always, want to give you a little bit of context. Here's our agenda. We'll hit, we're going to spend most of our time here in the talking about the offering and what's going on. Ask questions through the chat at any point if you have anything or comments. I'll try to keep an eye on those and dive into them. Got a little bit of a cold, so apologies for my voice sounds a little nasally. It's that season, colds are going around. So I'm going to give you some context really quickly on InflowCX because, who the heck are we? Some of you guys know, some of you don't. Look, we work in the contact center technology space, the core contact center, CCaaS, CX technology. That's where we live. We're a services and consulting company and really work in what we consider kind of that mid-market enterprise space. And so what I'll be sharing with you is our perspective as we talk with companies and work with customers in that space, what we're seeing and what we're experiencing. That's the perspective we come from. I think it's really important to note, though, that while we're going to talk about accounts kind of through that. This is the NASCAR slide. We're going to talk about accounts that are some customers we've worked with that are on different sides of the spectrum here as far as size goes. Some of them 70 agents, some of them several hundred or thousands of agents. And Genesys has that kind of wide range, and we work with that wide range of customers. But we also don't just work with Genesys, although we do. I'll talk to that. We're not just Genesys or bust, right? Company. We work broadly, and I think that's part of our value to the market is understanding and working with much broader set of the technologies. So yes, we do work with Genesys. We're a top partner of theirs, but we work with all of the main players in this space, whether they're kind of core competitors to Genesys or ones that are more in the ecosystem that complement or work in conjunction with Genesys or other providers. And so we'll bring that sort of breadth and perspective to what I share with you today. Let's jump into the meat of it, though, with that little intro. So this is a topic that's gotten a lot of press. Of course, when something like this comes out, you get all of the FUD, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt that gets spread by competitors and all that sort of stuff. That's not my intent with today at all. So let me just show kind of level set on what's been shared on this. So on PureConnect, and candidly, I actually started in this space 15, 16 years ago, working for a VAR in Northern California, where they were an early partner on PureConnect. And so I actually had exposure, wasn't called that back then, but it was the legacy interactive intelligence CIC product. So gone back a long ways. Inflow as a company, we don't have a practice around this, but familiar with the product. It's been a good product for a long time, lots of customers on it. Earlier this year, Genesys announced, started communicating in May to customers in January of 2024, so about a year from now, end of sales for all the subscription, for the subscription on the Prem product, for PureConnect Cloud, which is their cloud version of it, and the final end of innovation on that product. End of renewal a couple months later in August of 24, and then fully end of support for our PureConnect in the middle of 2025. There's an official announcement on it. I put a link on it here. You can see this. This is all published information that can be seen by all. So for that particular, and there's a decent group of customers in North America and globally that this is going to impact, that need to make a decision now what they're going to do. There's also, though, a group of customers, and I don't have the counts. I don't know the counts on either of these sides, but multi-cloud CX customers with Genesys that are also impacted. Earlier, just actually a couple months ago, press release came out. This was in conjunction with Genesys really doing a reduction in force, and they announced that they're no longer going to sell Genesys Multicloud CX, which is another offering. So there's not as much detail that I've seen published about this, but I think there's probably fewer customers on multi-cloud is my sense, but also they're committed to helping customers through the current contracts, but basically this is something that Genesys is sunsetting. So with that leaves kind of two bases of customers with decisions to make. What are they going to do? And of course, when that happens, you've got lots of competition who's eager to try to talk to them. But what are we seeing actually happening? That's what I want to share. Before we get to that, I mean, what is a signal for Genesys, right? Well, this is a quote from the CEO, Tony Bates, from that press release in October. Going forward, we're making a strategic pivot as a company and focusing all of our innovation, investment, and resources on accelerating the market leadership of Genesys Cloud CX. So all chips are in on that as their flagship product. That is not too much of a surprise to some who've been close to the organization for a number of years, but by making those announcements, they've really sort of pushed all the chips in. They're all in with it at this point. So, is that a good bet, putting all the chips in for Genesys? Bring our perspective to it. We've worked with the product since the interactive intelligence days. It was PureCloud at the time, and it was interactive, different company. We've gone through the ups and downs, and the product has matured quite well, I would say, and it's a very formidable competitor is the real short answer to that. And you can look, there's lots of data points to it, but obviously Gartner is one interesting data point. Gartner has Genesys ranked well. You can look at G2, you can look at other sort of review sites to get a sense. And no surprise, right? You see Genesys Cloud CX as a very strong, very viable option. Besides having worked with the product for many years, we've done a lot of deployments. We've seen a lot of customers migrate to this from prem solutions, from Genesys solutions, from Cisco, from Avaya, from other cloud solutions. So quite a bit of experience. So is it a good bet for Genesys? I think it's going to allow them to really focus and continue to do well. But if you're one of the customers that was just cut off at the knees of the announcement, you might have different feelings about that. I understand that. So let's dive into what are we seeing customers do. So this is what I would say the three paths that we commonly see, right? You've got path one, customers who are like, get it, I got it, let's migrate to Genesys Cloud CX. We worked with many customers on this. We just worked with a large utility, regional utility that did this transition recently, and overall a really great project. They had wonderful things to say, very excited for them, simplified their environment greatly, ease of administration went way up, really all positive, right? So there's some customers, and we have many examples of that, where that's the path for them. We'll talk about the why and the how that looks. Path two, though, is probably just as common, right? Where somebody says, look, I'm going to evaluate and migrate to something else besides Genesys. Or maybe I'm going to look at Genesys too, but I'm going to look at a lot of other options. It's very common. We have a customer, we did a case study with them on it, Plow and Hearth. They are a retail organization based in the eastern US. And, this was they had PureConnect Prem, and they were looking at, what do we do? How do we go forward from here? And really looked at the options and figured out, how do we do this? And what's the economic impact of making this change? So a lot of customers, that's the path they end up picking. And then there's some customers that are staying put, right? They're just saying, not for me, not right now. Now, that path has an end date on it, obviously, right? As talked about. So that there's going to be some changes sort of forced, whether people like it or not, basically because the wheels are in motion for lack of innovation and lack of support coming in the future for some of these platforms. All right, so let's dive into 1 and 2. There's not much to say about people who are staying put, but let's talk about the ones who are just saying, hey, look, I want to move to Genesys Cloud CX. And this is a good subset of companies that this is the path. Put a kind of a level of effort on this. Level of effort, I would say, businesses that we've seen taking this path, I would put it as medium, right? You're going to make a change. You could argue even like the migrating to Genesys Cloud CX, how much migration is actually happening? Well, it's really, there are some tools to help do some of the platform kind of database migration over, but most of this is actually really rebuilding and deploying a new technology completely. So migration might be a generous way of describing it, but it does have a lower level of effort for most organizations we've seen just because of how they go about the process. So let's talk about that process. And let's actually, before we do that, let's talk about the timing that we typically see. These are all just sort of illustrative, just to give people a sense of what we're seeing on the market with how long is it taking organizations to make these transitions. So if it's an easier or a smaller contact center, easier environment, meaning configuration complexities on kind of what we consider a lower level, not a lot of channels, maybe lighter on workforce management, WM requirements, not a lot of AI and bots and things like that being deployed. Simpler, 4 to 6 months typically from somebody saying, hey, I need to move off this prem Genesys to being live on Genesys Cloud CX. If it gets to more an average, say more in the 5 to 10 month range, getting more complex in either size or complexity of what the contact center is doing, 9 to 18 months, right? So that's some just rough parameters we've seen looking back at kind of engagements over the last couple of years. Why are people picking this path? This is actually pretty interesting. Most companies are picking this path that have either a positive or neutral Genesys relationship. That's actually a really fundamental thing. They're like, we've been pretty happy with this overall. And we hear that often with customers who are going down this path. Yeah, like this, they've been good technology for us. It's been a good product for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever. There's some level of people perceive this as an easier option. And that's debatable on if that's the case or not, but I think that's still a perception thing of people thinking of this as more of a kind of migration, or that's how they're talking about it internally. We've seen some organizations who are like, look, we understand it's a new product. We're actually internally communicating to leadership or whatever. This is really more of a migration. Okay, understood. So that's how some people are thinking of it. There's sort of a perception. I would say that generally there's less time required. That's nothing proprietary to Genesys in the process. That's really just about, if you think about this high-level process, most companies, this is what they're doing if they're going to move to Genesys Cloud CX from a Genesys end-of-life system. Look at the business and IT requirements, document those, understand what those are, see how Genesys matches up to those. 1 demo, 2 demos, 5 demos, right? Different sessions, really understanding the product and how it aligns well to those requirements. Okay, let's scope. How are we going to deliver this project on these things that we've identified are important? Let's do the contracting and negotiation discussion with Genesys, and then let's implement it. That's kind of the high-level process. That process is fairly simple and straightforward. Why it's more complex, and I'll show you on the next one, somebody who's selecting something else, it's pretty obvious. You're going to go out now and look at a bunch of different vendors, or maybe it's 2, or maybe it's 3, or maybe it's many, and there's lots of choices in that. That can obviously introduces more steps into the process. Really, the main decision you're making, if this is the path you're going down, is what are the types of usage when it comes to licenses, named, concurrent, metered. That makes the most sense for the organization. What's the license type? Genesys Cloud CX has a pretty, I'd say, simple licensing structure. Genesys Cloud CX 1, 2, 3, and then there's some add-on licenses, but fairly straightforward. What are the counts? What are the license types? Those are the choices that are being made versus a bunch of other upstream choices. So that's kind of the simple path 1 that we see and how it plays out. Let's jump. I'm going to see if there's any questions on. Okay, perfect. And Brendan, by the way, put into the chat a link to the case study on Plow and Hearth. So I mentioned that one. Plow and Hearth is an example of path 2. They wanted to evaluate this broader landscape and figure out what's right. And so they, here I'll hit the why first. And this was certainly true for Plow and Hearth too. They had it was an okay relationship. It wasn't really particularly negative, but they were like, we want to see what's going on. I will say that if somebody's got a negative, they're very easily and obviously going to look at options out here. That's one of the core things we see with somebody who's like, I just don't feel that the company values me, or we've just not had great experiences, stability, product, feature, functionality, whatever. So that's usually a starting point, but not always the case. The other thing that's really important is somebody's like, look, I have an obligation to our business, or I really want to evaluate what's going on in this space to make sure that we move to the right product, whether that's Genesys Cloud or something else. This is a harder level of effort, obviously, because now we're going to put more work into evaluating the landscape. And so timeframes, push out, no surprise, you're going to push out, you're going to add a couple months probably into this process. You can see on the right, I'm bouncing around, I realize a little bit, but you can see on the right, the choices are, there's a lot of choices. And this is one of the challenges, one of the things that makes it, this adds time to this, is there's a lot of choices. There's a lot of CCaaS players. We've kind of built this graphic over the years because this landscape continues to evolve. There used to be just a couple of kind of key competitors in CCaaS, but now you've got a lot more blending of different types of technologies into this space. And so there's a lot of options and choices. And this is all stuff that customers looking to make a change are navigating through. what we typically see for those who are saying, look, let's evaluate, we're seeing, probably not too surprising, common options that customers select: 5.9, CX1, some Amazon Connect is becoming more common. And then there's a whole host of other options out there, right? And a lot of great up and comers or untested, but there's just a lot of players. We do see some customers actually come back and run a process like this and actually select Genesys, right? They wanted to do their due diligence, they've done it, but they end up selecting Genesys Cloud CX. So that's not unheard of as well. So, this part of, this is not a commercial for us, but part of what we do is help customers navigate all this noise. And so, but it adds a lot of time and complexity. That's just the reality of it, right? If you look at the process, it's going to be similar in that, hey, what's the requirements? But then, RFI, RFP, vendor initiation, right? Getting the right group of respondents into the process, doing demos with all of them. And it's not just one, it's demos with multiple parties looking at different pieces of what's important to you as the business. Probably some level of measuring, how do these stack up? That's what we typically do with clients, is like, let's do some scorecarding. Let's try to take out as much of the bias, our own personal bias of that was a great sales rep, or they told great stories, or they demoed so well. And let's try to make it be about what's the product actually going to do and how does that relate to our priorities as a company. Down select providers, then get into scoping, then get into negotiation, do a final selection, get contracting, and then implementation. So it obviously adds some steps. This is the kind of thing where if you look back, if you think back to that timeline of here's where things are going end of life, and customers might feel like, hey, I've got a lot of time. The reality is making a good decision for something that's typically really core to a business, which contact centers usually are, takes time to do it right. It really does. And so if you think about all these high level steps and then all the stuff underneath it, it'll take time to do this. So a lot of companies will probably are, and we see them, or are starting to really kick off engagements around this to make sure they have sufficient time to make the decision that's good for them. So what are other kind of observations I can share with you, just kind of from the trenches we're seeing around this type of customer migration from this end of life announcement? One of the interesting things I would say is we do a lot of ROI and TCO modeling with customers. This is like a core component to us on evaluating contact center technology, is what's the impact, right? And it's much more than total cost of ownership. It's what's the ROI, because we're talking about efficiencies and enhancements and measuring how do we improve CSAT and all these kinds of things. How does that actually impact my company? So we'll model that. One of the interesting things of Genesys that is shocking, I think, to a lot of customers is it's actually not going to be as impactful financially for them from a additional cost perspective than they're thinking. Why is that? Well, I guess the simple way of putting it is people are typically putting in pretty good amount of money on an annual basis into their Genesys systems, some of these ones that are going end of life, whether that's maintenance, whether that's already subscriptions. So there's really not a lot of incremental costs, which is kind of a surprise. That's not always the case. There are many solutions that customers are migrating from where it's incremental cost, but that's actually typically not as common here. And again, I can't say that with 100% certainty for everybody on those platforms, but that's just been kind of a common theme we've seen. The other, there's a lot of gotchas on this too, that we see with companies making these changes. And some of this depends on if somebody's coming from a Genesys Prem or Genesys Cloud environment, not Genesys Cloud CX, but like a Genesys PureConnect Cloud. So some of these cost model changes, right? If you're on a Prem system, there's just lots of ways that, and some customers just aren't thinking of the different things that they should be asking questions about, like what's our true cost going to be on this? What's usage look like? What does overage usage look like? How does telco work? How do commitments and floors work? There's lots of these things that sometimes customers don't have as much experience with, and they might not have all the right questions asked. Other times, and we see this often, somebody's on a Prem system, they're actually procuring a CCaaS solution, is they're learning how to buy SaaS, software as a service, for the first time as a company. We still see this actually. It's not uncommon at all. Lots of questions from legal, lots of questions from procurement on how contracts work and all these details around it. And so that's something, if you're working for an organization where don't have a lot of experience as an organization buying that, that's going to add time to your process. I 100% will. I've seen this over and over. The other thing is really more of getting value out of it is a lot of companies changing to a CCaaS solution. It's not just about changing the technology. There needs to be an evolution internally around the mindset and kind of the program around thinking of the contact center technology is not a static. I love Ron Popeil quotes. So, right, the set it and forget it. We all remember that from the rotisserie thing in the 90s. You know, it's not that set and forget technology. The contact center is not in 2022. So whatever you're moving to, Genesys Cloud CX or any other platform, you have to, in order to really get the benefit of it, there has to be an internal change around how you think of the technology. It's not just like we put it in and we're done until we upgrade in 3 years. That's not how it works. You get a lot of feature functionality that's introduced into it on an ongoing basis, and your customers are changing and your organization is changing. So how do you think about your process for adapting and utilizing that differently? And that's kind of that whole transformational piece of this. And it's a place where a lot of companies, like, it just doesn't happen organically. You have to be purposeful around it, I guess is the point. Another change, right, or opportunity for things to go well or not go well in these types of transitions. No surprise, but what's the right amount of change that's appropriate to introduce to your organization? If you worked at a company for a long time or a short amount of time, you typically get a sense for, like, how well does this company do with change, with technology projects? And if it's not well, then you want to really limit the scope of what are the things we're introducing for change and keep it as finite as possible. Really have a thoughtful process on how this is going to roll out. What groups, what testing, what does user acceptance testing look like? And really that change management component is really important to have your arms around. No one will talk about that because everyone wants to sell you the tech. This is actually where the rubber meets the road around how important it's going to be and how your organization, and if you're in the business or in IT, how your customers, the users, the business units are going to perceive the success or failure of a transition like this. This is a huge point that that often gets skipped over to the detriment, I think, of the project. Another thing we see is there's an assumption often when customers are transitioning technologies, and we've seen this certainly with Genesys, that they just assume everything they have today is done the same or is the same feature functionality, plus I get new things. And that's not always the case, actually. So there's a lot of contact center tech that hasn't translated as directly into cloud contact center technologies as you'd think from a Prem, a Avaya, or a Cisco, or other, or Genesys Prem and things like that. So there's a false assumption made oftentimes around everything's just going to be the same. I have all the capabilities plus new ones. And really digging into what's important and what's required that's that whole due diligence, right? Digging in stage. That's really important not to skip. I think the last thing is this administration. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but the administrative workload will change some. There's no, upgrades, patching, that kind of stuff changes, but there's still needs on the system, troubleshooting and move adds changes and those types of things. And so just to be thoughtful around what's that program look like once we're live. It's not like it just runs itself. It's like an animal, a pet. You need to care and nurture for it still, right? So someone needs to do that, although it will shift, right? The type of work. In some cases, probably the volume of work too can shift and decrease, but it's something to be thoughtful about as you kind of engage on this. So I think that takes me to the end of kind of some of the things I wanted to highlight. We've summarizing lots of different projects and engagements we've been on for the last couple of years or actively in, and trying to distill out hopefully stuff that's useful insights for you as you think about for your environment or whatever place you're coming from. So with that, I'll see if there's any questions and answers as we get to the end of our time together. Let me check if there's anything in here. Let's see. Question around multi-cloud timeline. I've looked far and wide on that. I could not find any, and I've asked with Genesys, and I was not able to find if there's a defined timeline like there's for PureConnect. So I don't know the answer to that question. If there is something in there. Let's see, I think that was the only question. It looks like I haven't addressed in here. it looks like that's it. So here's what I'll leave you with. Look, if you have any questions, you're interested, this sparked something of curiosity, or you want to kind of hear more about what other people are doing or drill into details, reach out. Love to have conversations on this stuff. Personally, would be happy to talk with you or get you in touch with anybody on the team that is helping customers through these kinds of transitions. We do have a great case study on Plow and Hearth and kind of their journey, some of the things that they saw, how this process rolled out kind of in much more detail than I went through for them, and the good and the bad and all those kinds of things. So I think that's a really cool write-up that they did with us on that. But anyways, I appreciate everyone's time today. Thank you so much for spending some time, and wish you happy holidays and a great rest of your week.